Alright, during all the talk a few weeks back about, dare I say it, power creep, I found it pretty interesting how all the different discussions I was seeing was framed through the lenses of very different types of players. There were perspectives coming from every angle, from casuals, average players, sweats, and everything in between. To try and understand the different aspects of the situation, I figured it'd be a neat thought experiment to figure out what factors define these groups. To be clear, I don't necessarily think there's a definitive way to do this. At the end of the day, a whale will never be directly comparable to a casual free-to-play player, but I did want to give it a shot at the very least. I started by looking at the goals that a player could have when playing the game. Like, if someone is only playing through the game to clear the story, that's pretty different from someone aiming to clear the endgame as quickly as they can. I felt that defining these goals can really help pinpoint how one type of player is directly affected by the issues that we all talk about in videos like this. Personally, I think there's 4 categories of goals players can have, and 2 of them I mentioned just a bit ago. I think in order of effort, for lack of better words, put in by the player, it'd go like this. First, you have the story clearers or casuals, and those players basically just attempt to clear the base game content with whatever characters they like. Then you've got what I would consider the average player, which is someone who logs in every day and tries to clear some of the content past just the story, like entry-level endgame and events. The next step would be the above average players who try to clear all content at the max difficulty possible, meaning any endgame like MOC, pure fiction, and all that kind of stuff. And lastly, a kind of mesh of 2 groups would be the spenders, whether it's through time or money, and they spend those resources in pursuit of chasing the meta to clear all the content available effortlessly. One of the things I was originally trying to do when I started thinking about this topic, and also why it's important to define these categories, was basically to try and figure out where I personally would fit into them. I've spent money to get the meta units, and I've also cleared all the content in the game since 1.3, so theoretically I should fit into that last category. But after thinking about it, something about that just didn't sit right. I kind of started questioning my own logic there, because as I've said in previous videos, I'm someone who likes to use my favorite characters, and I really never chased meta past getting whatever I needed to make my favorite stronger. By my own previous statements, I should actually fit into the other categories like average, or maybe just a little bit above average. Like, I used to not really care about clearing all the content or making sure I had the meta supports and teams and everything else, because I played the games as I thought they should be played, just a game to collect the characters I liked without much else to it. But I feel as time went on with HSR, I actually started to change the way I played the game, and I moved more towards a meta-focused mindset. Here's a direct example. If I go back to my favorite gacha that I still play, FGO, I still frequently use my favorite characters in that game to clear the content. I maxed my favorites out, I got them the supports they needed, and I'm able to use them wherever I want to. I don't feel pressured to get the meta supports that are needed for the characters that I have but don't play, because in that game my mindset is just to use the characters I want to use. But despite that, in HSR I barely use any of the characters I would consider my favorites anymore. Obviously, yeah, you could say it's just because of power creep.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
But that didn't sit right either. To try and figure out why I don't really feel compelled to use my old favorites, I basically tried asking myself some questions to pinpoint the reasons behind that. Like, do I not like them because they're bad? I mean, sure, partially, but that didn't feel like the whole reason either. Maybe it's because I stopped liking how they look. I mean, also no, I still think all the characters that I'd consider my favorites are cool or hot or whatever else. Did I get bored of their gameplays? I mean, definitely not, because I'd actually consider some of the older characters like Blade to have more fun gameplay than the newer ones. So what is it? Or I guess what's left? Well, if you noticed, one type of question was actually missing there, and it's about the characters themselves or how they are in the story. When I thought of that bit, it was almost like a light bulb went off in my head. What I realized was that my reason for playing these newer age gachas had shifted from what still keeps me playing the older ones. Not fully, to be clear, but definitely enough to make me go, oh, wait a minute, how did this happen? See, the older gachas had such a massive emphasis on selling you the character itself because most of those gachas are all basically just PNG collectors. Like, yeah, sure, there's definitely still some good gameplay in there, but when you compare FGO's visual presentation to something like HSR's, it's a night and day difference, and that's only further magnified with games like Genshin that have open worlds to explore. These newer games don't really have an incentive to sell you the story of a character because you get so much more with all their fancy animations, the gameplay, the worlds you can explore with them, and everything else. They don't follow the visual novel type storytelling that used to be common because they just don't need to anymore. In short, these newer games are selling us a package where the older games have to sell you the character itself. So basically what I realized was that the attachment I have to the characters in these games nowadays is relatively superficial. I might like their gameplay or their animations or their design, but I can't say I care about them enough to want to become one of the crazies that dedicates their life to just one character. As I was thinking about that more, I kinda came to the conclusion that this is something very intentional by the newer Hoyo-esque games. The older games have to get you attached to the characters because outside of their involvement in the story, there's just not much else to really get attached to with the game itself. For example, characters in Hoyo games are usually only relevant for the duration of their appearance in the story, like a Luofu character will only be seen on the Luofu. On the other hand, in a game like FGO, characters will always have a realistic chance of showing up in events and story because the stories are written in a way where older characters can remain relevant to the ongoing plotlines. Like, there's some launch characters in FGO that still regularly show up in events despite that game being 9 years old at this point. On the other hand, Hoyo usually only brings characters that are currently being sold by them on banner into the spotlight, with some rare exceptions I can think of like Luca in the War Dance event and a few other IPC cameos. Going forward, I'd really like to see more of that from Hoyo because we just don't see some of the older characters anymore, and this would be a great way to add relevance back to them. Despite those cameos, unfortunately the emphasis on story feels intentionally lessened because Hoyo doesn't need to invest that much into it to get you to roll for a character, and as a result, I feel like it's a lot easier to just move on from one character to the next and always chase the new hot thing because the value of a favorite character is just significantly less than it is in other games. Even though story relevance isn't a big factor, Hoyo does still give players a variety of reasons to roll for their characters, like their animations or their kit. Personally, I've been influenced by those other factors before. For example, in Genshin, I got Yelan because her kit was more valuable to me than anything else. Another example is that I'll probably be getting Castaris whenever she releases, assuming that the dragon in the trailer Hoyo posted is actually part of her kit because it was so cool looking to me. Like, I haven't even finished the 3.0 story at the time of writing the script, but I still want to get her without fully understanding her character just because of how cool that animation was. And all of this isn't even mentioning the support scenario. In a lot of the older gacha games, supports were generally pretty universal. For example, back when I played Arknights, you would usually bring Scotty Alter because her supportive capabilities pretty much helped every unit. On the other hand, in these newer games, there's a lot of units restricted to specific types of teams or damage archetypes, like Black Swan for Dot and Branya for Hybrid carries in HSR, or someone like Goro from Genshin for the defense scaling units in that game. This can be applied to damage units as well, like how certain units are basically entirely meant for pure fiction at this point, and others, namely break units, are really good at stuff like Apocalyptic Shadow. All of this stuff is intentional to get you to keep investing in a variety of characters, and also to make it more difficult for you to get attached to specific ones, because at the end of the day, the more characters you roll for is more money made by Hoyo. I do want to be clear, I don't actually think this is a bad thing on its own. Like, being able to have more than one character that you invest your resources into is kinda nice, because that means you can always have something to chase, which a game like this honestly needs. Resource investment into a character has an end. Like, eventually you're gonna run out of things to do with your first character when you max them, so this leaves it open for you to move on to the next, especially if you only got the character for one of the specific reasons Hoyo gives, like just their animation or only their design. That said, if you end up rolling for a unit just off of one criteria, it definitely plays into Hoyo's hands. For example, if you rolled Firefly just because her animations, you might get bored of looking at them, and because you're not attached to Firefly herself, it can heavily incentivize you to roll for someone like Rappa as well. All that said, it still didn't really sit right with me. I realized more recently, mostly during Sunday's banner, that I don't necessarily want to always be pressured to roll for a new character, especially if it's a unit that I personally am not super interested in. So from now on, I guess I've changed my mindset again. Will I get meta characters? Sure, if there's someone I actually like. For example, the Herda that released this patch. But if I don't like a unit, regardless of how meta they are, I think the best way for me to play going forward is to just skip those units. It's not optimal, and it might cause me to miss a clear here and there in the endgame, but with how unfriendly chasing those clears is in HSR, I'd rather just focus on what I want out of the game. Don't get me wrong, steamrolling the content is fun, but as I always say, I just want to do it with the characters I actually consider my favorites. How do you feel about all this? Do you feel the pressure to roll on a wide variety of characters, or are you still someone that just chases their favorites? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe, join my Discord link down below if you want a place to hang out and chat, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.